Well, I do, because I don't think there's really been a strategy at all. I mean, what you've got to do is place this in the context of a real strategy, the one pursued by the national movement in Scotland for the last 25 years. And that was to establish a parliament in Scotland, to support the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, the reconvening of the Parliament, and to have that as the bridgehead by which you advance the independence case. Now, that strategy has been spectacularly successful in political terms. It's brought independence from being a distant dream to a very realisable proposition, and brought the SNP from the fringes of politics to the centre stage, replacing the Labour Party as the dominant force in Scotland. Now, why you should gamble that strategy by going to the UK Supreme Court and asking that court to effectively rule against the UK and for Scotland, I have no idea whatsoever. So the result wasn't unexpected, but to risk a hugely successful political strategy in doing that is mind-boggling. Well, I no doubt the Scottish Government is open to criticism for prevarication and delay. I'm much more concerned about the lack of preparation and the going to the Supreme Court and expecting to get a favourable result. I mean, look, if you're going to risk a court challenge, then the way to do it is to put your bill through the Scottish Parliament, have it reinforced by a democratic majority, and then, of course, it might be challenged, but at least you'll have that basis of a democratic vote. And courts, even the Supreme Court, are sometimes leery about overturning a parliamentary vote. And if you're not sure you can do it directly on the question, then do it on a question like extending the Parliament's powers to include an independence referendum. I mean, that's the tactic I had up my sleeve 10 years ago when I was persuading David Cameron to agree to a consented referendum. You do it in a way you can win, not in a way you're going to lose. Now, listen, if the Supreme Court had just said yesterday, we're dismissing the Lord Advocate's case. It wasn't a particularly well-put case. I don't blame the Lord Advocate, incidentally. She clearly didn't believe a word she was saying. If they'd merely left it at that, then they'd probably have got away with it. But Lord Reid, for reasons best known to himself, decided to go on to question Scotland's right as a nation to self-determination. And I think that's going to stick in the craw of Scots. So ironically, out of a very dangerous tactic, you might well get a reinforcement of Scotland's sense of nationality and being said, well, look, we're not going to get the Supreme Court in London telling us we're a second-class nation, because Scots of every political hue, by and large, over the last 50 years, have agreed that Scotland is a nation and has the right to choose the government best suited to its needs and the constitutional settlement it wants. I mean, that's something that both the late Donald Dewar and I were proud to sign and endorse. Well, you've got three better options than the one that was chosen. I mean, one, you could think of this before you appointed the Lord Advocate. I mean, there's plenty of distinguished advocates in Scotland who would have been proud to certify or to approve such a bill. I can think of Joanna Cherry, for example, or Aidan O'Neill. It would be examples of distinguished advocates in Scotland who would have taken a contrary view to that of the Lord Advocate. Secondly, as you say, you could have a backbencher do it with advice in good faith. I mean, that's another way to introduce a bill. Or thirdly, you could introduce a bill that you were confident would survive the challenge of competence, which is probably the route I would have favoured. Any three of these options would have been better than the charge of the Light Brigade to the Supreme Court.
But the current First Minister is...
Well, I've already said, I think going to the Supreme Court on the basis it was done was an incoherent strategy. But ironically, and it's the law of politically unintended consequences, Bernard, what the Supreme Court has done, what Lord Reid has done by overreaching the question he was asked, by apparently dismissing Scotland's right as a nation to self-determination, is going to provoke a reaction in Scotland. I mean, it is very ironic. I mean, but establishments tend to be like that. They tend to overreach themselves in their idea that they're going to absolutely squash any sign of dissent that comes before them. They've gone to a position which is unsustainable for the Supreme Court or for the government of the United Kingdom or for most thinking unionists in Scotland. Very few people are going to stand, as Lord Reid did, and question Scotland's national right of self-determination. I mean, international law terms, Scotland's a recognised constitutional entity. There's a precedent from 2014. We have the institutions of a nation, including a parliament. And most people, most decent people, not just in Scotland but around the world, would say that nation has the right of self-determination, and it is unsustainable to try and pretend or say otherwise. You know, Scotland cannot be legislated out of existence by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. Well, let's jump our fences. I mean, the first thing that should be done is not wait till next year to have a discussion about it. It's to get the majority of MSPs, the majority of MPs from Scotland who believe in Scotland's right of self-determination to make a declaration to that effect. Summon an independence convention to challenge the idea that Scotland doesn't have the right to decide. And that would resonate, flung in the face of the London government, that would resonate very strongly internationally at the present moment and be a rallying call for the people of Scotland. That's the first thing to do. Secondly, the sort of popular agitation we saw in response to the Supreme Court, that should be embraced and not be a one-off when Scotland gets a kick in the teeth. It should be something that's part of a vibrant national movement. Thirdly, the MSPs, you know, where there's a majority for independence, you know, mustn't look like bystanders in this particular debate. They should be making initiatives, making declarations, as I said, perhaps even passing a bill which would withstand legal challenge. And then you get to the position of what you do in terms of a democratic test. Now, you're right that having a de facto decision through an election, whether it be the Westminster election or the Scottish election on independence, is fraught with difficulties. But it is possible to do. You just have to think about it and work out exactly how you present it. And one requirement I would see to make it a success would not be to stand on a party political basis, but to stand as Scotland United, upholding Scotland's right as a nation to independence and self-determination. If you want to crystallise things as a one-issue campaign, then that's the way to do it.
So
yes, and I mean, there's a precedent for this. It's not an exact precedent, but if you look at the 1918 election, where if you remember the old fox Lloyd George managed to persuade everybody else to stand as Liberal Lloyd George Coupin, Labour Lloyd George Coupin, Tory Lloyd George Coupin. He fought a Coupin election and made it about a single issue, i.e. the single issue of Lloyd George. So that would be how you do it. You do SNP, Scotland United for Independence, Green, Scotland United for Independence, ALAPA, Scotland United for Independence. That's the technical way you could do it. Now, I'm not saying that isn't got lots of discussion needed, but you have to do something like that to make that the issue of the campaign, as opposed to, for example, the SNP track record on the health service or on the ferries or whatever the other parties will want to fling at the independence candidates. To make it a single issue campaign, you have to stand as single issue candidates. You can't just treat it as a normal party political election. I'm not saying it's not fraught with difficulties. I mean, that's why I chose the referendum route. But nonetheless, something requires to be done. I do think there is this possibility, unless I misread Scotland very greatly, I don't think people in Scotland are going to stand for being told that they don't have the democratic right to vote for independence if they so choose. Now, that is something deeply ingrained in the Scottish psyche. You know, and I know, that Scots of all political persuasions have signed up to that position, and they're not going to be told by the London Prime Minister number 3 this year, or the Supreme Court in London. That's not the case. I think the Supreme Court unintentionally perhaps have let a fiery cross that they won't be able to control. Well, then that comes back to political determination and political will. I mean, there are ways to exert pressure, real pressure on the Westminster government. I just don't happen to think many of these have been tried. And that is a combination of political initiative, parliamentary interventions, popular agitation, international pressure. That's what you bring to bear on a government which is unwilling to accept Scottish democracy. Now, I don't see much sign of any of these things being tried over the last few years.
But it seems the logic of
but I suspect that there now is a climate of opinion where people realise they're going to be necessary to bend Westminster to Scotland's will. But first of all, Scotland has to demonstrate the will. Well, I mean, that's an easy road to tempt somebody to go down, but I mean, I prefer to say let's stick to the Scottish constitutional tradition. Let's have the convention, let's assert Scotland's sovereignty, let's have the legitimacy that that confers, let's demonstrate there's popular will, let's bring the international pressure to bear, let's play Parnell with Westminster. I mean, you know, the ARP MPs a few months ago got flung out the chamber, disrupted the proceedings, and of course that upset Westminster for a day. There's enough nationalist MPs in Westminster to do that every single day, or to do it through parliamentary procedures. I mean, there's all sorts of ways. We're not helpless bystanders in this. What you need is the political will to enforce the democratic decision of the Scottish people, and you've got to telegraph to people, you know, you've got the intent to do it, that you're not going to sit back and let Scotland be told it's a second-class nation. Most self-respecting Scots don't accept that and wouldn't expect any self-respecting Scottish politician to accept it. Well, as you rightly say, it can be reconciled because it was reconciled in 2012. I mean, you know, David Cameron wasn't an enthusiast for allowing Scots the opportunity to exercise their sovereignty. He had to be persuaded that was the least worst option, that we were going to do something if he had said no to the mandate that was achieved. And now we're in a situation where that's going to have to be demonstrated again, and perhaps demonstrated more forcibly. There's been a lot of ground lost over the last 8 years. There's no doubt about that. I'm merely saying to you that I saw within the overreaching arrogance of the judgment that somehow Scotland didn't have the right to decide its own future a spark which will resonate through Scottish politics. I don't think people will accept that, and I think there is the potential to marshal a campaign which will overturn it. But, you know, listen, there's many countries have had to find a way to obtain their independence from London government. I think it's about 50 since the Second World War, so they've all managed it. So as long as Scotland observes the absolute requirement to a peaceful constitutional path, everything else should be brought into play. Popular agitation, parliamentary intervention, the Scottish Constitutional Convention, international pressure, all of these things are part of the Scottish armoury to enforce Scottish democracy, and so they should be.